so much. We'll call up our next panel, and this will be our last panel for the afternoon. Then we'll have a break before our keynote interview this afternoon, or later this evening. The chair of this panel is Benedict Rogers. Please join us here. He's the president or the CEO of Hong Kong Watch, and the topic of this panel will be religious freedom under authoritarian governments.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great privilege to moderate this panel. And can I say it's a delight to be, firstly, to be back at another Earth Summit. I've taken part in summits in Washington, D.C. and in Taipei. And it's wonderful to be in Tokyo. My mother actually lived in Tokyo for a number of years before she met my father, before I was born. So it's always a joy to come to Japan for that personal reason. And it's a particular privilege to chair this panel with four friends, three of whom are long-standing friends of mine. Tim Peters, the director of Helping Hands Korea. We've worked together for quite some years. Dr. Tang, the president of BPSOS. We've collaborated particularly on the Southeast Asia Freedom of Religion or Belief Network, the C4 network. My good friend Bob Fu, the president of China Aid, and then my new friend, who we've just met for the first time last night, Professor Saho Matsumoto from Nihon University. So welcome to all of you. Before I open up the discussion and invite the distinguished panel to share their perspectives on this topic, let me just share some opening thoughts to frame the discussion. As Peter said, I'm Benedict Rogers. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch, but I've also worked for many years on many of the issues that we'll be discussing today, on North Korea, on China, on Burma, or Myanmar. I've traveled to all three, North Korea only once, the others many, many times. I have the dubious distinction of having been deported from Burma not once but twice, and denied entry to Hong Kong. So I'm grateful to the Earth Summit and indeed to the government of Japan for allowing me in here. I've also been threatened with a prison sentence in Hong Kong and named as a collaborator in the ongoing trial of the entrepreneur Jimmy Lai, a devout Catholic and pro-democracy and pro-religious freedom campaigner in Hong Kong. I believe this panel is a particularly important one because Asia includes some of the world's most brutal and most repressive authoritarian regimes. Four of them communist, China, and sadly that now includes Hong Kong, Vietnam, Laos, and North Korea, plus the military dictatorship that seized power in a coup in 2021 in Myanmar or Burma. In most of these, religious freedom has been repressed very severely for a long time. In North Korea, for example, being a Christian means literally risking your life, risking execution for reading the Bible, or at least a lifetime in a prison camp for praying. In Myanmar, Burma, under successive military dictatorships, Christians have faced restrictions, discrimination, and in recent years, war crimes and crimes against humanity. And of course, the Muslim community, particularly, but not only the Rohingya community, face a genocide. In China, the Chinese Communist Party has always sought to restrict religion. But I don't know if Bob would agree with this. I think it's fair to say there have been periods of intense persecution in the past and periods of relative relaxation. But today in China, we are witnessing perhaps the worst period since the Cultural Revolution. We're seeing the genocide of the Uyghurs, the intensifying atrocities in Tibet, continued persecution of Falun Gong, and severe and intensifying persecution of Christians. And now in Hong Kong, we are seeing religious freedom impacted by the dismantling of freedom itself, turning what was once one of Asia's freest and most open cities into a police state. I wrote a new report published by Hong Kong Watch late last year called Sell Out My Soul, The Impending Threats to Freedom of Religion or Belief in Hong Kong. And so while probably most of our discussion will be on these most egregious situations of North Korea, Vietnam, and mainland China, let's pay attention also going forward to what happens in Hong Kong, because I believe that is an emerging real concern, not only for freedom itself, but for religious freedom. And of course, Vietnam and Laos, we see continuing violations of religious freedom. So that's the context of what we'll be discussing. And I'd like to turn to our panel with an opening question, first of all, to ask each of you in turn to tell us briefly the trends that you see in the countries that you're particularly focused on, and a little bit about what you're doing to address it. And maybe we could just go down the line, starting with Tim, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Ben. And before I say anything else, I want to express how very much I appreciate the invitation to attend this summit. After 28 years on the Korean Peninsula, working to help North Koreans in crisis in China and actually within North Korea, sometimes you can feel a little bit as a voice in the wilderness and on the frontier, but to be able to join other like-minded individuals who care so deeply about these issues regarding freedom of belief is an extraordinary encouragement. So I thank the co-chairs and everyone involved in the invitation. It has been the work of Helping Hands Korea for since 1996 to attempt to help North Koreans who have fled their country, the repressive, increasingly repressive policies of North Korea, to seek better economic conditions, to seek freedom, and in some cases to seek religious freedom as well. In short, our main work is to assist people who are sending distress calls from inside China, mainly the 3 provinces that immediately abut North Korea. That would be Heilongjiang and Jilin and Liaoning. This is where the great majority of North Korean escapees find hiding places. The trend that I see, and which is deeply troubling, and I think it would be a double trend, North Korea itself, the government of Kim Jong-un, has become increasingly repressive to its population in general, but also to the Christian population. And it is making it more and more difficult for people to leave the country without permission. That includes mining some of the border areas. Keep in mind, this is not mines for the enemies of North Korea, but it is actually for their own population that might attempt to leave. So the cost of leaving North Korea is increasing. The added difficulty is that the Chinese government in Beijing is increasing its surveillance along the Sino-North Korean border to detect escapees who are coming across. And for those that succeed in doing so, there is always the policy of Beijing to detain them on Chinese soil and then to forcibly repatriate them to North Korea. As you can imagine, the consequences and the punishment for North Koreans to go back, to be sent back, can be extremely severe, including torture. In some cases, I don't want to exaggerate, but in some cases, women who are pregnant with Chinese babies have to endure forced abortions. and extended prison camp for others, extended prison camp incarcerations, etc. So these are the trends that we see. In short, I can say, as a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, sometimes these increasingly repressive policies have a way of backfiring. Let me take one example briefly. During COVID, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, became so paranoid about introducing COVID into his country, and that because the very fragile healthcare system might collapse, he told the Chinese government, don't send any refugees back during COVID. Well, this was music to my ears, because it was the first time in a quarter of a century that we heard anything like that. So despite the complications of COVID, I asked those of our partners on the ground in China, if you're willing to keep going, let's accelerate what we're doing to evacuate these people, because the Chinese will not repatriate them. So actually, ironically, the time of COVID was one of the most fruitful and productive times of evacuating people out of China. And so those are interesting and sometimes, how can I say, unexpected consequences. I'm sorry if I went over time. Excuse me.
Thank you, Tim. Dr. Tang.
Yes, I'm Nguyen Đình Thang. I'm the CEO and president of Boat People SOS, an organization established in 1980 by former refugees from Vietnam. I arrived in the U.S. As a refugee in 1978. 10 years later, I went to Hong Kong to help the boat people, Vietnamese boat people there in Hong Kong. And we continue to have operation. At the time, we established a legal aid office in Hong Kong. And we continue to have legal aid office operations in Thailand right now. And for the past 14 years, we have helped thousands of refugees fleeing their countries of origin, from Pakistan to Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Burma, China, even Russia. And 90% of them fled their country of origin because of religious persecution. And from that point of view, I can tell, I'd like to remind that Vietnam is under communist regime. And it is different from any other authoritarian regime. Communist regime views all religions as the opiate of the mass that must be controlled, if not eliminated. It's likewise for China or North Korea or Laos. So there's no distinction between minority religion or majority religion. Now, in Vietnam, the government controls all religions, all religious activities using two entities. One is the Government Committee for Religious Affairs. It is a unit under the Ministry of Home Affairs. And it approves certain churches to legally operate only if those churches comply with the policy of the government. Other churches, independent churches, would be considered as operating illegally. Now, the second entity is the Ministry of Public Security, the bad guy. The MPS is in Vietnam currently is similar to the Stasi under the former East Germany, or the KGB under the former Soviet Union. And its role is to use brute force, including arrest, beatings, torture, enforced disappearance, imprisonment, and sometimes also extrajudicial killings to force people to join those government-approved churches. So the two work hand in hand. Now they use two tactics in general to control churches in Vietnam. One is the tactic of substitution. By late 1990s, the government completed its effort to outlaw, to eliminate all the churches that have existed before the communists came into power. For instance, the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, the Hoa Hao Buddhist Church, the Khmer Krom Buddhist Church, the Cao Dai Church, they are all outlawed. And that affected tens of millions of followers. Once it got outlawed, the Committee for Religious Affairs set up, created new organizations. These are not religious organizations. These are pseudo-religious organizations. They are tools of repression used by the government to subjugate the independent churches and the followers of those independent churches that have been outlawed. For instance, let me give you one example. In 2022, a small group of Buddhists named the Zen Hermitage on the edge of the universe, very small, about 30 members, monks, and they got sentenced. Their founder, a 90-year-old founder, and his 5 disciples were sentenced to 23.5 years in prison. Why? Because they dared to call themselves Buddhist monks without the prior consent of the government-created Buddhist church. And these government-created churches became the substitute for the real churches that have been outlawed. So if you go to Vietnam now, or you invite delegation of Vietnam, most often, most likely, you will meet with the representatives of the fake churches. Now, the second strategy is co-opting, and Katrina earlier today mentioned about that. The government has co-opted a number of evangelical churches in Vietnam because they have ties to Western countries. So the government needs to be more subtle in that approach. Let me take one example of the Evangelical Church of Vietnam North. Its Hmong Christian members have been forced to abandon their faith, left and right, to this day. And instead of protecting their followers, this church expelled them when these members refused to abandon their faith. So beware that these are the 2 tactics being used in Vietnam right now. And again, the trend is really grim because the Communist Party chief just passed away 3 days ago. And the next one in line is the former Minister of Public Security, the Butcher of Vietnam. So he might become the next Communist Party chief. He's now already the president of Vietnam. So he will consolidate all the power in one man, and that is General Tô Lâm. That is the Butcher of Vietnam. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a very concerning update. Bob.
Yeah. My name is Bob Fu. I'm the founder and the president of China Aid, a nonprofit Christian NGO based in Texas with a mission to advance religious freedom and rule of law for all in China. We did do our mission by exposing the abuses of the persecution, by encouraging those who are persecuted, by equipping the grassroots leaders. To summarize the basic trend, I think I would maybe first of all, in a general term, as Ben just mentioned, I think the level of persecution against Christians, of course, besides of the 3 genocide, as Ambassador Brownback this morning alluded, against the Uyghurs in the East Turkestan, the Tibetans, and the Falun Gong practitioners, between 100 to 130 million Chinese Christians, I think, are now currently experiencing the worst persecution we have not seen since the Cultural Revolution in 40 years. And I can illustrate that in a few trends. The Communist Party, before Xi Jinping's regime, Xi Jinping took power, really the management, we called management or persecution of Christians, really, more in the mood of control, and sometimes maybe in different regions are more intensified than the others. But after Xi took power, the goal of the Xi Jinping's regime has changed from control or simulation to now really eradication, to really elimination. And we have seen for the first time in 40 years, the Chinese Communist Party forbade all children, even students and even medical doctors, to believe in Christian faith. Millions of Chinese Christians were forced to sign a Communist Party prepared form to renounce their faith in public. And Christian parents, children, employers were all encouraged by the local regulations to betray each other, whether they can find a copy of the Bible under the pillow. This only happened during the Cultural Revolution of Chairman Mao in 1960s. And it has monetary incentives. So anybody who report this kind of so-called illegal religious activities would be rewarded up to, like in Guangzhou, up to 100,000 US dollars. So we also are seeing the Communist Party, of course, to totally banning the Christian private education, and all the foreign missionaries for the first time since 1955 were kicked out. We talk about thousands, hundreds of thousands. Even those who are engaging in humanitarian charitable activities, like helping the orphans, educate, training the orphanage teachers, were kicked out. So, of course, under this banner of Sinicization, the Communist Party, again, ordered the churches, even the mosques, were to sing the Communist Party's national anthem before they can sing their doxology, praising their Lord. So Xi Jinping's picture and Chairman Mao's picture were mandated to be put on the pulpit. So this is really this first step toward elimination. I think this is the recent trend shows the Communist Party even try to criminalize the most fundamental elements of Christian worship. Pastors, one after another, now many, had been arrested for simply putting an offering box, a Christian offering box, both practiced by the Catholics and Protestants for centuries, are now being criminalized as a business fraud. So many pastors already got sentenced from 3 years, 4 years, 7 years imprisonment for collecting the tithing and offerings. So at China Aid, of course, we have been under our 3E mission, continue to be a voice for those voiceless brothers and sisters. And occasionally, when they're facing an existential crisis, we have to rescue them. And one of the most recent examples was the Mayflower Church. Of course, with the international coalition by those of us, including both co-chairs of the Earth Summit and the USERF and U.S. State Department, finally, after being exiled for almost 3 years, they were being accepted by the United States and resettled in the state of Texas. 63 of them now are able to live peacefully, practicing their faith freely. So we're thankful. I think, and together, if we work, joining, hands in hands, really some positive fruits can be born. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. And Professor Matsumoto.
Thank you very much. My name is Saho Matsumoto from Nihon University. I understand, I think there are only a Japanese academic here in this conference. I got involved with this International Religious Freedom Summit at State Department 2019, and I became fascinated to part of it. So I'm very honored to taking place here in Japan. So thank you very much for people who organized and invited me, and particularly the ambassador, the Brownback. Okay, I'm the expert of the Christianity, particularly Catholic Church and the Vatican diplomacy and interreligious dialogue and the world affairs. And indeed, in Hiroshima, the last week, there was also interreligious dialogue and over AI ethics took place, which I also participate as observant. So this is my main the conference for me. Okay, so I'm sort of going around the case with China and Vietnam and Myanmar and North Korea that I've been talking about. So it is estimated there is between 10 and 12 million Catholics in China. Vatican would like to establish the permanent office in China, which would be a major upgrade in diplomatic relation with Beijing. However, it's involved a lot of compromise with the Communist China for the Vatican, such as accepting the Chinese veto over the old bishop that Pope appoints. That is a violation of the 2018 accord between the two states, Vatican and China, and it raised a danger of a Sinicization of the Catholic Church in China. It would also mean one of the PRC is the condition that Vatican could cut the diplomatic relation from Taiwan, which is the last home of the Chinese democracy. Vatican obtained the permission last year to have the residence papal representative in Vietnam, which is another communist-run country with which does not have diplomatic relations. In the south of Vietnam in particular, there are a sizable number of the Catholic people, but they are subject to monitoring. I have a Vietnamese friend, a member of the former boat people community, who I have met at the Catholic University Sacred Heart here in Tokyo. Now she's naturalized as a Japanese citizen and she's a very dedicated Catholic, and she enjoys religious freedom here in Japan. But when she returned to Vietnam to meet her relatives, she had to be very, very careful to government surveillance. 7 years ago, in 2017, Pope Francis had an emotional meeting with a Muslim Rohingya refugee from Myanmar in Bangladesh, and then calling for the world to pay attention to their plight. The Pope urged the world not to ignore refugees, a persecuted minority, that's the poor and vulnerable. The encounter took place at the Interreligious Peace meeting on his first full day of the Bangladesh, and 425,000 Rohingya refugees have fled from Myanmar, and due to the army crackdown and the inter-ethnic and religious violence. The situation in Myanmar has even got worse, and since then is after 2021. Regarding North Korea, the Pope has sent Archbishop Galega I think number 3 in the Vatican, to South Korea in order to negotiate with the North Korea government to stop its Christian religion persecution. But it turns out to be extremely difficult even get restricted religious freedom. So I just have a sort of survey of the other speakers, and then from more the academic point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor, you've raised a topic that I was planning to come to later in the discussion, but I'd like to build on what you've just outlined now. The issues you've presented are, I think, of real concern to many of us, certainly to me personally. I've written on this topic many times. If you Google my name and Vatican and China, you'll find quite a few of my articles. And it's something that I feel very concerned about because I became a Catholic in Myanmar. And I'm very close to the Cardinal of Myanmar, Cardinal Charles Bo, who has been very outspoken on human rights, actually not only in his own country, but also in China. And he's spoken many times for the situation in China and Hong Kong. So I'd like to ask maybe Bob Fu, Dr. Tang, and Tim Peters, your response to what we've just heard from the professor and what you observe. Is it right for the Vatican to be seeking relationships with these kind of regimes? And I should add to the list, actually, I know the Pope has spoken of his desire to visit North Korea at some point. Is that the right position for the Vatican to be taking, or should it be a stronger voice, as indeed Cardinal Bo has been, in speaking out for human rights and religious freedom? Maybe, Bob, you could respond first, and then we'll go down the line.
Well, it's nothing wrong for the Pope to desire to extend the areas of the concern on evangelism and the salvation of the Catholic flocks. But it is very wrong to choose to dance with the wolf, knowing that, especially his flocks, the members of the Catholic Church, as a professor just mentioned, had been under even increasingly worse persecution under that secret deal that so far nobody else even knows about it, and keep extending. And especially when, Ben, you mentioned about what's happening in Hong Kong. You know, the bishops, the cardinals had been under criminal threat, right? Just for simply speaking up or standing in solidarity out of his Catholic faith with the oppressed and persecuted. I think it's time for the Pope to give up, to abandon this appeasement policy, and to choose the right side with his church rather than with the Communist Party regime. That's my response.
Thank you, Bob. Dr. Tang.
Yes. I think that Vietnam is way ahead of China in dealing with the Vatican. China is following Vietnam's model. The Catholic Church in Vietnam is the one exception to the strategies of substitution and co-opting I just mentioned, probably because it's direct ties to the Vatican. So it is the only independent church legally recognized by the government, but at a hefty price. As early as 2012, the Vatican has already agreed that has conceded appointment of bishops in Vietnam must get government approval. Way ahead of China. China is trying to catch up now. And it's not all. As part of the deal, the Catholic Church of Vietnam, in Vietnam, must acknowledge and accept and tolerate the Committee for Solidarity of Vietnamese Catholics. This is a creation of the Vietnamese Communist Party. It's not part of the church, but they have a lot of influence. Thousands members of this committee have so far infiltrated the church, the Catholic Church in Vietnam, at all levels. And let me give you a few examples. 4 years ago, a very young priest who was very outspoken. He was vocal to defend the rights of his parishioners. They were victims of the Formosa caused spill of toxic waste into the ocean. So his parishioners are fishermen, so they were affected. He spoke out, and he was forced by his bishop into early retirement at the age of 44. He's now retirement already. The second example is that just 2 years ago, there's a person by the name Ho Hu Hua. He got ordained as a Catholic priest, but that caused an uproar because people found out that he was just released from prison 12 months before for corruption. He practiced fortune telling before, and he was part of a network of police officers who were involved in high-level graft. He was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months. Upon release, just 12 months later, he became a priest. So no one knew how he could bypass all the regulations of the church to become a priest so soon and with that kind of background. So clearly the Catholic Church in Vietnam has lost its internal control.
Thank you. And lastly, Tim, should the Pope visit Pyongyang?
Well, I would concur with my colleagues here. Actually, about 8 or 10 years ago, the Pope did visit South Korea, and at that time, I'm not nearly as prolific as you, Ben, but I did write an article rhetorically asking politely, in public, if the Pope would address the egregious, human rights situation in North Korea, particularly relating to the persecution of Christians. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if he read it or not, but sadly, he did not in any way address that, and that was a huge disappointment to me because I felt that of all the Christians in North Korea, he should definitely be reaching out and comforting and encouraging and standing up for the persecuted church, which, by the way, the underground church in North Korea has been categorized by the well-known World Watch list by Open Doors as North Korea's, the state has been treated as the most egregious state persecutor of Christians for the last 22 years. So for me, it was an enormous disappointment. So I would say that I don't think that would be a wise decision for the Vatican to go that route in North Korea either.
Okay. Can I just add one sentence on this topic? I just remember. It's really, I think the Pope and the Vatican should really apologize to the whole world for hosting a kind of a health forum on organ transplanting in the Vatican, in Rome, when the whole world, including an independent tribunal based in London, has concluded with irrefutable evidence showing the Chinese Communist Party has committed this crime of organ harvesting from living persons against Falun Gong and, of course, the Uyghur people. So why on earth, is there any moral or even religious kind of obligation, for the Pope to invite the minister of Chinese, the health ministry, go to Vatican to host a conference to tell the whole world China is doing great for organ transplant. So,
absolutely. Well, I remember that very well, and it was a very shameful moment. Thank you for your comments there. I'm going to turn to our penultimate question, and if we can get through this and the last question, hopefully there'll be time to open it up to questions from the floor in the last few minutes. But I want to turn to the question of the fact that with many of these regimes, their repression is not confined to within their own borders. There is a growing phenomenon of what's now known as transnational repression. In a very tiny way, this is nothing by comparison with what the people of these countries face, but in a very tiny way, I've experienced this myself. I've had threatening letters come through my door of my home in London. I don't advertise my home address, but I've had anonymous letters from Hong Kong threatening me. Some of my neighbors in the street where I live in London have received letters telling them to keep an eye on me. Even my mother, who lives in a different part of England, has had letters telling her to tell me to shut up. And thankfully, she's got a good sense of humor, and she's told me she'd given up trying that many years ago. But if that's happening to me, and I'm a British citizen living in a free society, you can imagine how much worse it is for people from these countries who are living outside the borders and who face the long arm of the state. So I wonder if the panel could just address this briefly. What is the trend and how can we counter it? Maybe Dr. Tang, you could start on this.
Yes, very concerning. As mentioned before, we have an operations in Thailand protecting refugees coming from different countries. And we have observed an increasing trend of regimes, including Burma, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, engaged in transnational repression. Let me give you one example. For the past 7 years, I have coached a group of young Montagnard Christians. These are the hill tribes people, indigenous people in the Central Highlands, Vietnam. They fled their countries, they fled their home villages because of religious persecution. And yet they continue to advocate for religious freedom for their peoples back home. And they founded the Montagnard Stand for Justice organization. This is a human rights organization. And they are prolific in producing reports on violations, like, to submit to the UN, different UN special rapporteurs, the USERF here, State Department here. And just January of this year, they were declared to be a terrorist organization. And its founder, Equing Bodap, was sentenced to 10 years in prison in absentia. And now Vietnam demands that Thailand extradite him to serve his sentence. And not only that, we gathered a list of about 22 others, Montagnard advocates for human rights and religious freedom, who are on the blacklist of terrorists. One person, Becky, many of you have met her at the ministerial, at the Earth Summit before, at the CFOP conference recently. She was on that list. And 3 months ago, we had to relocate her to Switzerland for her own personal safety. So that is, it highlights how serious it is. So we have people in Thailand right now, their life is being threatened, their safety is being threatened. Thanks.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to comment on this?
Well, actually, I think I've mentioned already in passing that China, the government in Beijing is cooperating hand in glove with the North Korean regime in terms of catching and detaining North Korean escapees in China, and then against all of their agreed obligations among international conventions and laws and human rights, etc., labels all the escapees as illegal economic migrants and then sends them back, even at the risk of the outcomes that I mentioned. Some North Korean ladies that I've met admit to carrying poison with them, or some have slashed their wrists if they're in detention in China and they hear that they're going to be sent back. They're willing, in some cases, to even attempt to take their own life before they have to face consequences by the Border Patrol in North Korea. So I've, in a sense, already alluded to that. There's, to some degree, intimidation that occurs in South Korea among the escapees that have resettled there. And I think the South Korean government does a pretty good job of filtering out, spies and things as coming through the refugee flow. But there's no question that whether it be China in working hand in glove with the North Korean regime, as well as other agents that have been sent through, that it is a concern.
Thank you, Bob.
Those evil regimes, such as China, of course, Iran, and North Korea, are not satisfied with their repressive effort to their own people inside their own territory. They are extending their long arm to the other parts of the world, including the free world. I mean, just this morning, actually, in our own conference site, and I met with maybe the only Chinese Christian family who come here as a visitor in the last minute. And they told me basically out of their 5 children, 4 were adopted before they left China, and the 4 adopted ones were confiscated by the Chinese government a few months ago. Confiscated. 3 are still missing. And only 1 was known kind of in somewhere they couldn't help, get him back. So they don't feel safe even here in this hotel. So they left this afternoon, and just because they're Christians. And of course, myself, I testified twice before 2 congressional committees in the past few months on the Beijing's transnational repression effort. I mean, you remember that's back to 2020 in my home, in West Texas, as we already are naturalized American citizens, in the U.S. soil, our house were being besieged for 3 months. From 9 o'clock, this group of Chinese thugs sent by wearing masks, and every day from 9 to 4, besieging my home in front of our neighborhood with loudspeaker and broadcasting to the whole world, calling for Bob Fu's elimination. So my whole family, including our children, had to be exiled. The FBI, the local law enforcement, with all kinds of arms, weapons, have to escort us from our back doors, because those thugs, sometimes as many as over 100, they were there stationing. So these transnational threats are very real. I, in the past couple years after that, received death threats with messages, and sometimes I receive phone calls from the NYPD, LAPD, Washington D.C. police, and ask me, said, "Are you checking into this hotel tonight? Are you setting up a bomb?" Because the Chinese use this tactic by booking a hotel, very expensive hotel, non-refundable, under my name, with my own email and phone number, put it, and then called the police, said Bob Fu is going to set up a bomb. So these are happening. Of course, we all know what has been happening in New York and Los Angeles. When the Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen visit New York, the Chinese consulate sent their thugs, hired thugs, beat up those who just voluntarily welcoming the president of Taiwan, and 3 of them were wounded, so severe they were hospitalized, and yet no one was held accountable. No arrest was even made. So I think there are a lot of work to do. To counter this very egregious effort of transnational repression. Of course, the over 100 Uyghurs in Cambodia, right? They were already recognized refugees by the UN. In front of the UN, in the Cambodia airport, the Chinese sent a military cargo plane and loaded them off, right? And only a few managed to escape. The rest of them basically have never been heard. Presumably, all may be killed already. So very serious effort, so we all need to be aware.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob. Professor, before we turn to the last question, would you like to add anything on this topic?
Yeah, luckily I don't have a direct experience or anything like that, but I have a Chinese Catholic friend here in Japan. She used to come to same church which I go, but she stopped coming to our church, and just later I find out that she felt threatened going to Catholic church in Japan, and probably herself might be safe as far as she stay in Japan. But problem is that her family and parents still are in China. So I think it's, basically it's, in that case, even in Japan, these Chinese Catholic people couldn't stop coming to the church to the worship, which is the great obstacle of the freedom religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time, but I'd like to ask one final question. And if I could ask our panel maybe just to answer this with one or two sentences, just because of time. But I'd like to ask you, given all the challenges we've discussed in this session, what can democracies in the region, most especially I'm thinking of Taiwan, South Korea, and of course here in Japan, what can they do to address these issues? And Professor Matsuo, perhaps you'd like to start on that. What can democracies in the Asia region, especially Japan, do?
Yes, I think there was already being said Japan is one of the democracy country, maybe some restriction of the freedom of religion, but generally is we enjoy the freedom of religion and freedom of speech here in Japan. And I think Japan should take more leadership and initiative for all the neighbor country, the country like China and the North Korea, and then, there was many people who were prosecuted for religious reasons. And today's morning, I introduced the Rohingya community representative here in Japan. And then, so he's a Muslim community. And then, I think we should take more leadership and accepting as more religious refugees here in Japan, and to be more criticizing these dictatorship regime in the neighbor countries. Thank you.
I want to talk about the aspect of protecting Taiwan. We all heard from President William Lai. As far as I know, if Taiwan is invaded, occupied by the CCP, God forbid, I think the first bloodbath genocide would be the killing of hundreds of thousands of members of the Taiwan Presbyterian Church, because they are the most viciously attacked target by the Chinese regime as the so-called pro-independent forces, or separatists, they call it. So, just to think about that, of course, more than 90% of the most advanced chips in the whole world are made in there. Our flight won't operate if we don't protect Taiwan, and let alone if the regime, the genocide against this one particular church, the largest denomination with over 1,300 churches over there.
Yes, two things. One is that the government of Japan can use its geopolitical and economic power to send a clear message, say, to the Vietnamese leadership. They tend to hear a lot from the usual suspects, like America, right? Like the UK, like Germany. That would surprise them if suddenly they hear from the Japanese government expressing concern about what's going on inside Vietnam. The second thing is I echo Professor Matsumoto's recommendation that Japan should consider as part of its immigration policy. I know that Japan is facing shortage in labor and will need to import about 1.2 million workers over the next 5 years. Why not taking in refugees? In Thailand right now, there's about 10,000 urban refugees. 90% of them are victims of religious persecution. Japan easily absorbs the entire population if it wants to, and many of them have good language and labor skills.
Yes, I would agree with all of the above. I would say that the current presidential administration in South Korea has shown quite a distinct improvement, perhaps, over the previous one in terms of being very clear in speaking out about human rights in North Korea and not being overly cautious about, aggravating or agitating the regime in the North by speaking out. And so I feel that that's an encouraging stance that South Korean government could do. But I think it needs to be more than just expressions. I do feel that if there could be a linkage together with other democracies, with Japan, with Taiwan, etc., to advocate for, specifically the situation with the North Korean refugees, but other issues related to international religious freedom. South Korea has a potential for being a strong voice, including economic influence and pressure, etc. And I think it could actively resettle more North Korean refugees easily. It's only been 35,000 up to the present, and I think more could be done.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think, I'm looking at Peter, we are out of time. I'm very sorry that we couldn't get to Q&A. I was optimistic at one point we would, but there's so much to discuss on this topic. But please, if you do have questions for our panel, come and find them in the break. All that's left for me to do is to say a very big thank you and to ask you to join me in thanking Tim Peters, Dr. Tang, Bob Fu, and Professor Matsumoto.